Greetings and welcome everyone to this fifth installment of Florence Live, the series of conversations on the post-corona world brought to you by the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute in Florence. My name is Fabrizio Tassinari and I'm the Executive Director of the school. The overarching theme of today's session is Africa. We had in fact already in the previous sessions a distinct Africa angle, specifically on climate and migration, and I would encourage you indeed to rewatch those. But today's focus is on Africa, front and center, the impact of COVID-19 on Africa, whether and how the pandemic has changed Africa's perception and self-perception, and on Europe-Africa relations more broadly. Before introducing the session, I would like to welcome straight away in the room the two main speakers of today. And Mr. Janez Lenarcic is the European Commissioner for Crisis Management in the von der Leyen Commission since 2019, in charge of European civil protection and humanitarian aid. Prior to this, Mr. Lenarcic had a long and distinguished career in diplomacy, Secretary of State, and then permanent representative of Slovenia in the European Union, as well as director of the OSCE's Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. A warm welcome to you, Mr. Lenarcic.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be with you.
And the second speaker is Mr. Mo Ibrahim, on the bottom of my screen, businessman, philanthropist, founder and chair of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation. The foundation carries out pioneering work to bring about meaningful change in Africa, providing tools to support leadership and governance. A warm welcome to you too, Mr. Ibrahim. So, on today's session, where were we before COVID-19 struck? Where are we today, and where are we headed in the weeks and months ahead? On where we were, I guess the first point to highlight is a paradigm shift that the European Commission imprinted in its relations with Africa. The Commission elected Africa as a privileged partner of its own geopolitical outlook to the world. President von der Leyen visited Addis as the first destination outside Europe of her mandate, and the whole Commission visited again the African Union at the highest level, even as the pandemic struck. So on the face of it, this new approach heralds a shift in the logic of partnership, one made of exchanges, trade, co-development, and it will be indeed very interesting and significant to see where we are now with that. Where are we now then? It's the impact of the pandemic, which so far at least provides mixed signals when it comes to its impact on Africa. On the one hand, there are huge vulnerabilities, uncertainties, and risks. It's yesterday's news that Africa passed the 300,000 mark of registered cases of COVID infection in all 54 African states, up from 200,000 on June 12th and up from 100,000 on May 22nd. So clearly there is a trend and it's going upward. At the same time, Africa displayed also remarkable examples of resilience, preparedness, and perhaps also lessons from the past of previous epidemics, such as Ebola. So it will be indeed very important to underscore these and understand the context. Where are we headed now in the coming weeks and months? There's a new discourse emerging about a new African century. In fact, it's not so new anymore since the phrase was originally coined by then South African President Thabo Mbeki over 2 decades ago, but it's reprised time and again, most recently in a special report by The Economist in the middle of the pandemic. It's a new African century made of growth, both economic and demographic, entrepreneurship, urbanization, improved governance, notwithstanding existing challenges and hurdles about poverty, welfare, infrastructure, security, and sometimes also statehood. So the discussion will revolve around these very broad themes: Europe-Africa relations, the response to COVID, and the future. But I guess the first question to kick us off is really a bird-eye view on whether and how COVID-19 alters this dynamic of Africa's own rise and of Europe-Africa relations. And I would perhaps give the floor to Mr. Lenarcic first to give us his view.
Thank you, Mr. Tassinari. It's again a pleasure to be with you all here today. First of all, a very quick reply to your question. This year, 2020, was set to be the pivotal year in the relationship between the European Union and Africa anyway. And I think that this will still be the case, even if the situation is unfortunately very different as we could ever have expected half a year ago. But there is a clear logic why this Commission has placed Africa at the top of its agenda, because anyone who travels to Africa, and as I did since very early in my mandate, I saw the great potential of the continent, the potential especially in its own people, especially the young people, the entrepreneurs, the politicians, the innovators, the activists. And I found this also inspiring. This continent looks to me young, confident, brimming with potential and promise. Of course, there are also challenges. We all know about it. And I, as a commissioner also responsible for humanitarian aid, have a full load of those challenges that we help African partners to deal with, like conflicts, violence, poverty, effects of climate change, and so on. However, these challenges do not hide the fact that Africa is the continent of opportunities. And I'm sure that the Africa's youth will be able to transform this continent politically, economically, socially, in every way. The COVID crisis does not change that. Actually, when we look at this crisis, there are various facets of what we see. First, Africa is at the moment, as far as health impact is concerned, seems to be less affected. There are many theories circulating why that is so. There is a theory that the virus came with a delay to Africa due to relatively less intense air travel compared with Europe and the West. Then there is another theory that points to the young population of Africa, which is supposed to be less vulnerable to the virus. There is another theory that says, well, there is not as much testing in Africa as it is elsewhere. Maybe that is the reason. My personal impression is that Africa boasts of a rich experience of dealing with epidemics. You know, in Europe and in the West, we did not expect this to happen, because the last thing of this order, the last infectious disease and pandemic of this order happened 100 years ago, the so-called Spanish flu. So nobody in his or her living memory experienced anything like this, like we are experiencing now. Africa, on the other hand, has had its experience with Ebola, with measles, with cholera and other infectious diseases. And I think that prompted Africans to take this threat seriously from the beginning. So we still don't know where we are. As you said, Director Tassinari, figures are mounting, numbers are going up. We hope this will not become a trend, but we still don't know where we are. What we are trying to do is we are trying to help our African partners also in this area. That's why we have, in addition to our EU strategy with Africa, and this title is important. This is not EU strategy for Africa. No, we want to work on our partnership and our relationship with our African partners. And the aim of this has been, even before the COVID crisis, to unleash the potential of Africa and especially in the sense of the green and digital transition, and especially in the sense of placing their youth and women in particular in the driving seat of growth and development, and of course, peace. All this has not changed with COVID crisis. On the contrary, I think this crisis has only accelerated and amplified the need for such partnership. We should not forget we are neighboring continents. We see Africa as our twin or sister continent, and this has not changed by the crisis. On the contrary, we think that we should proceed even with a faster pace towards building this strong partnership where we could work together with our partners to enhance learning, knowledge, skills, research, innovation, capacities, particularly for women, for youth, and these efforts would, of course, come alongside our overall objective to deepen and adapt our support to Africa, also in the areas of peace and security.
Thank you for this upbeat view. May I ask Mr. Ibrahim, how do you see it, and could we actually come to see this moment as a turning point, one way or the other?
Well, I totally agree with the analysis of the Commission Lenarcic. I hope I pronounced his name correctly. Yes, we apparently seem to have suffered less of the coronavirus for many reasons, which the Commissioner mentioned. The fact is, nobody knows really how this virus develops, interacts, mutates, and whatever. We are really at the very early stage of trying to understand the science here. There's a lot of confusion. But what's happening on the ground is that, leading us to cautious optimism, because it may really hit us hard later, second wave, whatever, especially the numbers are rising now. So we cautious, but we hopefully cautious. What concerns me actually, as much as the virus itself, and maybe even more than the virus, is the economic impact of it. Because the breakup in the international trade and fact that major sector of the economy is hit hard. Tourism in Africa, hotels, service industry, etc. That is huge hit for Africa. A lot of sectors of the economy have been hit. Unfortunately, unlike our richer friends in Europe, elsewhere, their governments were in a position to really offer support for citizens by doing cash transfer. Go and stay at home and we'll send you some money. That's what really most of the world countries want to do. Then the huge package of financial support to the private sectors and companies, etc. African countries, unfortunately, don't have the fiscal space to offer that kind of support to citizens or to business. And that is really very worrying, because Africa has been growing reasonably, not as fast as we hoped, but it has been averaging 4%, 5% growth over the last decade or so, which is fine. But not as much as we hoped. But the problem now is Africa, probably they're going to go into recession. People expect us to go back minus 15% of growth. Recession actually. That is going to be a serious problem. Some steps have been taken, which is to deal with some of the debts. G20 suggested that installments on interest could be pushed back for this year, etc. It's nice, but it's not enough. Because public debt action is only a fraction of the total debt, and also, what about China? I mean, one third of the total debt of China in Africa is held by China. What China is doing there, and it's trying to show some international leadership. What's happening between China and US, and I'm a good guy now. I'm an internationalist, and then, okay, show us how you're going to act as diplomatic. Well, that's a call for the Chinese to really show us the proof. We need to see the proof. So we need to really act like Europe and other countries. I was very impressed also by the call for action, which has been issued. It is very rare incident, actually. That letter signed by 10 or 11 African leaders, and I think 9 European leaders of many countries in Europe, France, Germany, Spain, Portugal, Netherlands, etc. Really declaring that in order to really defeat this, we cannot declare victory without having calling for package of $100 billion around that number, mixture of good review, ground support, medical equipment, etc., to help what's going on. And that's a wonderful moment of solidarity. We really, as Africans, appreciate the position Europe here. And I think Europe needs to take the lead. It will take the lead, I'm sure, in really helping, supporting Africa during this difficult time. For a simple reason, Africa really is the closest territory to Europe. I mean, it's a few miles away from Europe. Any problems in Africa will reflect in Europe. If we have a failed state in Africa, this will be a huge migration problem in Europe. You know that. And that is a major problem for democracy, liberalism, all what Europe stands for, because how that's been used and exploited for terrorism, etc. So this is a serious issue, and I think really the relationship between Africa and Europe needs to be cemented, and I welcome all the signals coming out from Brussels and about the importance of the relationship between countries.
Thank you. Thank you. You touched upon several of the themes that we will be developing in the course of this hour. I should say at this point that we will try to have this conversation as interactive as possible. In fact, we are receiving already many questions from the audience, and I will try to intersperse some of these questions as we go along. At the same time, we feel it is also important that the story of Africa, what you have already started to discuss, is told by and from Africa. And therefore, at this stage, we would like to tune in some of the, as discussants, if you like, some of the emerging policy leaders that we have hosted at the EUI's School of Transnational Governance to ask you some topical questions on the themes that you have started to touch upon. So without further ado, I would like to let in the room now Anik Law Chuendem from Cameroon. Anik Law is a policy officer at the UN Refugee Agency. Hi, Anik Law, good to see you.
Hi, good afternoon.
And her main focus is to build and reinforce economic self-reliance of forcibly displaced people in the Horn of Africa. And you worked prior to this in the World Bank and in the African Union. The floor is yours, Anik Law, for asking questions.
Thank you, Fabrizio. Good afternoon, all. My first question, actually I have 3 questions. The first 2 will go to Commissioner, and then the last one will be for Mr. Ibrahim. So, I mean, relation between Africa and Europe have always been, unequal and unequitable. But in the wake of COVID-19, we're seeing a different dynamic. Europe seems to be the epicenter of the crisis and in need of help. So my two questions to Commissioner is, what happened when European countries that are deemed richer are actually in need of help compared to African countries, whereby African countries seem to face less fallout from the COVID-19 and the epicenter is in Europe. And we also seem to emerge that places like the UK or the US are actually struggling to manage the crisis compared to to countries like South Africa or Turkey. So that's for you. And then the last question is for Mr. Moore, which is about will Africa be able to negotiate his position with Europe and the other powers post COVID-19?
Thank you, Annie-Claude. Before answering, I would add one additional question coming from the audience. Zach Schmali is asking, have the EU's funding priorities changed during the pandemic, and what can the EU learn from Africa's own response? Perhaps Mr. Lenarcic can start.
Yes, with pleasure. Thank you for these two questions. First, the question to Annie-Claude Troindem. You see, I think that nobody was spared in this pandemic. Nobody. All of the world has been affected one way or another. Some people fell sick, some died, so health impact has been there. But health impact is not the only impact. We also have economic impact and social impact, and that has affected everyone globally likewise. As I said earlier, Europe probably didn't take this seriously enough from the beginning because this kind of epidemics, this was something that was happening elsewhere. Recent experience, for instance, SARS or MERS or Ebola or Zika, all these outbreaks were localized and eventually died out. This pandemic is unprecedented. It has spread all over the world. It has spread very fast, and it has taught us Europeans that it can also happen here, something that we did not recall. And that's, I said, I think that's probably the reason why in Africa measures were taken quickly, decisively, and for the time being, and hopefully this will remain so, the health impact on Africa has been relatively limited. Europe, on the other hand, has been able eventually to bring this pandemic under control, although there are great fears that there would be a second wave, especially now with the summer travel season. But you can see what is happening, especially in North and South America at the moment, where figures are going up dramatically. So my key point is that this pandemic is a global challenge. We all need to work together. And for Africa, I think the lesson for Europeans from Africa is that it can happen also in Europe. Now we know. We thought that this was not going to happen in Europe. Now we know it can, and now we can learn from the experience from others, including from Africa. But I would like to underline one more thing. While it has affected people and communities globally, this pandemic has not hit everybody equally. Generally, those who already had less are suffering more, especially when it comes to economic and social consequences. And this is something that we need to bear in mind. The existing inequalities that we have had in the world, within states, between the regions, are set to be aggravated by this pandemic. And that's why we have to work on that. We have to tackle these inequalities that are going to be probably aggravated otherwise. The other question on the funding priorities and whether they have changed. Not really. What has changed, we have adjusted some of the EU funding to make it more COVID relevant. So something that was, for instance, devoted to supporting health systems in general was adjusted so as to enable our partner countries to respond to the pandemic through supporting the diagnostics, through supporting the provision of personal and protective equipment, and things like that. So funding has not really changed because, as I said, especially when it comes to Africa, the social and economic impact of the pandemic is, at the moment at least, much more pronounced than the health impact. And our efforts to work with our African partners are therefore made more urgent, but they are not much different than they were before the pandemic.
Thank you. The question to Mr. Ibrahim was if Africa's negotiating position with Europe and other world's power will change. Mr. Ibrahim, I've been told that your audio is rather poor, so if you could speak closer to the mic, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Okay, I'll try to shout. I hope you can hear me better. I don't think so. I don't think so. I don't think the relationship between Africa and Europe should be that transactional about who's in a strong position, who's in a weak position. It really should be anchored in principles and long-term issues. It is not just about taking advantage of this moment etc. The relationship is moving, I think, at a reasonable place. My foundation, together with the Friends of Europe Foundation, we do have a platform and we continue discussion, bringing together European, international, civil servants, and together with the African leaders, African civil society, and business people to have freedom of discussion, which helping a lot really clear the air and to understand what the issues are. So I'm very optimistic actually about where the relationship is going. One thing outcome actually, I think, not only in Africa but also in Europe, is that we're gonna revisit our perception of public goods. Governance is about delivery of public goods, and suddenly we realize that we have not paid enough attention to the health system in our countries, whether in Europe or in Africa. That applies almost everywhere. Uh, African leaders committed to really increase the support to the health systems in the countries some 15 years ago or something, and they never developed that. They never delivered. And so now people say, hey, you have to pay attention. I was also, I was in London during the peak of the epidemic. I was isolated and I happened to be there. And I could see the irony when people will come out in the evening to applaud the health workers. I think that was happening not only in London but everywhere. Everybody goes at night to applaud the health workers. The same health workers and nurses who had to go to strike a couple of years ago because the governments in UK froze their salaries for 3 years. The lowest paid people in our society are really health workers, people working at homes and, in hospitals. And those people who died like flies because the governments could not provide them with protection kits. And it's terrible. And I think there is going to be realization by governments, whether in Africa or in Europe, that really health is an essential public good. We need to pay attention to that.
Thank you. And thank you for underlining the difference between a transactional approach, which is not what, and we are for a reason called the School of Transnational Governance, because that's precisely the opposite of transactional. So thanks for that. And thanks, Anik Lor, for intervening. Let us move on to the second large mega trend we picked, which is precisely the response to COVID in Africa. And for this, I would invite in the room Luther King Fasehun from Nigeria. Luther is actually a medical doctor who was at the school last year doing very pioneering work on building a policy advocacy group for maternal and newborn health across sub-Saharan Africa. And is currently doing a PhD in epidemiology in Temple University in Philadelphia in the United States. So good morning then, in your case, Luther, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Tassinari. It's a pleasure to be here. So my first question goes to Commissioner Lenarcic. I want to thank you for your leadership of the European Commission. So this question relates to the issue of response and preparedness, right? We have seen some remarkable best practices in Africa during this crisis. Uganda, for example, immediately closed its airport and all borders about 24 hours after the first COVID-19 case was reported there. And then also Ghana, they did some pool testing where several blood samples were preliminary tested. And this is an effort that has been hailed as one of Africa's success stories in COVID-19. Now, however, though, Africa's response has presented some challenges in terms of the limited capacity of the national health systems with constrained resources and manpower for other essential services. So my question is this: how do you see Europe as best able to help and support Africa in this crisis? And how do you see Europe drawing positive lessons in terms of having Africa better positioned to drive its own innovation in health?
Go ahead, Commissioner.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Fasehun, for this question. You mentioned best practices. Indeed, I can tell you that I personally was able to experience such best practice, for instance, in Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso, where I traveled in February, and there were temperature controls, disinfections everywhere already there then. In February, for instance, when a few places in Europe practiced that, even though, as we know, Europe was already then entering its outbreak. So that just shows that experience counts, and Africa has had fresh experience with infectious diseases, and that's why I think it reacted promptly in most cases. Also, you mentioned the capacity of health systems. That may also be one of the reasons why the situations were so different. In Europe, you know, the trust in the health system is great, strong. We believe that whatever happens, then you will go to the health system and they will fix it. In Africa, there is, and rightly so, more emphasis on prevention. But now to the question: how can Europe help in best way to support Africa in this crisis? Already early on, in April, we decided that in view of the fact that this is a global challenge and that has to be dealt with globally, in the sense that nobody is going to be safe as long as there is still a hotspot of this virus somewhere. We need to look around, we need to look beyond our borders, and this was quite an important achievement because, mind you, at that time, in early April, Europe was absorbed with the dimension of the crisis on its own continent. So we managed to persuade everybody, all the players, that is EU institutions, as well as member states, that we need to already early on look beyond our borders and work with others. And we succeeded. We launched so-called global COVID response as a team Europe, meaning European Union institutions, including our financial institutions, as well as member states, pooling the resources together also to work with our partners beyond our borders in Africa, first and foremost, of course, to deal with this pandemic. And this global response drive has already managed to mobilize 36 billion euro. In addition, as you may know, we organized a coronavirus global response conference, pledging conference, which already mobilized almost 10 billion euro. And this is going to be channeled towards rapid diagnostic, treatment, and vaccines once we have. For the global response in general, we plan to channel this funding on three fronts. First of all, the immediate urgent health crisis. Okay. So what I already mentioned, personal protective equipment, testing kits, intensive care unit equipment, so on. Second track is strengthening healthcare systems and including research and innovation to fight the virus. And finally, the third, no less important track is to help businesses and communities globally to recover from the pandemic. I think this is particularly important for Africa because, as I said, at the moment, the social and economic impact of the pandemic in Africa is much more pronounced than the health impact at the moment. So we would like to work with Africa because Europe wants Africa to recover quickly and sustainably.
Thank you.
Maybe
you had a question for Mr. Ibrahim, I believe.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Commissioner. So my next question is to Mr. Ibrahim. I want to thank you for your leadership through your foundation's work. Thank you so much. So the question is about demography, right? So recent scientific models have suggested that Africa's youthful population will contribute to reduced COVID-19 infections and deaths on the continent. At the same time, demography is usually perceived to be one of Africa's challenges, right, in terms of access to education and employment opportunities for the youth. So my question is, how do you square this paradox? Or to be more precise, how can we come to see Africa's demographic challenge in a more positive light?
No,
That's a tough one.
Thank you much, Luther King. Let me start by saying I really love your name, Luther King.
Thank you, sir.
Your father is a nice man. He gave you a good name.
Thank you, sir.
Right. Demography, our Africa youth, has been always in one of our main concerns. We published a number of reports, we had conferences, meetings, discussions, because I think personally, and our friends in the foundation think it is a major challenge facing Africa. And it's a two-edged sword. Depends how we're going to deal with it. In one hand, it is wonderful to have young population. It's wonderful to have a vast working force. That is a great thing for the economy. But when we say a working force, how we prepare those young people to be useful for the economy, what kind of education systems we have, what kind of training we have, how many jobs can we create. Unless we are able really to take really care of the development of these young people. Look, our education system needs to completely overhaul. Most of our education systems in Africa are relics of the colonial time, where The education system purpose is to generate clerks who are able to deal with the administration. And I've been through that system where handwriting is more important than mathematics because as a clerk, you need to write really beautiful letters and to know how to pen the nice. That was the emphasis. And I kept asking, I mean, who cares about how beautiful my handwriting is? You know, I need to learn a calculus, I need to do that stuff is needed. And anyway, we haven't many countries have not really moved the education system forward. We don't have technical schools. You know? Everybody wants to end up wearing white collar, as you say. You know, uh, we, we need mechanics. We need builders. Who's going to build the roads? Who's going to build the airports? Who's going to build the ports? Who's going to build the electricity? We need technicians. That is a huge gap of know-how among our people. Technical schools, I love them. That's what we need. Technical schools. We need people who are really able to build it. So we need to shift. I tell you an example. I interacted a lot with our universities in Africa. 27% of our African university students are studying humanities. 2% are studying agriculture. And I ask the question, 50% of our population live on and off the land. That is the most important thing in our economy. 2% studying that. 27% studying Shakespeare and Moliere and excuse me. What are you going to do with that? It's beautiful. It's nice thing to be cultured, but you don't have a job. And then I suppose support you. Go and get a job first, and then read Shakespeare. It's wonderful, but do that in the evening. But you need to have a day job. And there is another interesting statistics. In some African countries, you know, the higher your education, the less chance you get a job. Think about that. You are wasting money. Educating, you know, people, preparing them for jobs which doesn't exist, and not teaching people skills needed, divisions needed. So that is something very important for us to do. If we fail to do that, what will happen? There is a tsunami of young people coming with no jobs, no training. What's he going to do? They end up being criminals, join terrorists, or jump in a boat to die in the Mediterranean, trying to go to Europe. Is that what we want for our young people? So it is a problem. And our countries can suffer from unrest, serious civil unrest. If we have a large number of unemployed young people, no hope. When you lose hope, what do? You do all kinds of crazy stuff. And that is something really need to pay attention to. So where it's gonna go, I just touch wood. I hope it's in the right direction.
Thank you. And thank you, Luther, for coming in. In fact, thank you, Mr. Ibrahim, for focusing on higher education and universities, because that was, in fact, a couple of the questions that we received. How do you see, or do you both see the role of universities in improving the partnership? I believe Mr. Ibrahim already answered, and then perhaps Mr. Lenarcic can intervene later on the same question. I would now then move to the next discussant, and if you like, the next large theme of today's discussion, which is perhaps the future. And there I would welcome then Marianne Iwara, who is a peace practitioner, peace building practitioner, currently working at the Nigerian Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution. Good to see you, Marianne. And I believe you have two separate questions, one from Mr. Ibrahim and one from Mr. Lenarcic. The floor is yours.
Yes, good afternoon, and thank you very much for the opportunity. I have two questions, and one is for Mr. Ibrahim and the other is for the Commissioner. So I'll start off with Mr. Ibrahim's question. And the question is focused on the economy. It's focused on debt, growth, aid, and trade. The IMF and the World Bank have offered some debt relief. Even China also holds 1/3 of Africa's sovereign debts. And African countries, even up to recently, went back to China seeking for more funds to borrow. COVID has clearly delayed the progress in terms of the implementation of the African Free Trade Area. It's also forecasted that in Africa, we would return to recession, something that we haven't experienced for almost 25 years. We have also seen a lot of intervention, especially in terms of the private sector stepping in. For instance, you have Jack Ma of Alibaba who stepped in and provided some medical facilities for Africa. So my questions are as follows. First is, to what extent will the gains in terms of Africa's self-sufficiency be impacted by COVID and the economic slowdown? The second question is, how can the African private sector help in this regard? The first question is from Mr. Ibrahim. Yes.
So it is a difficult question because Africa is in a tough place economically at the moment because large sectors are taking up close down. You know, it's very sad. I mean, we have a investment in a company which largely with jobs in Africa.
So could I ask you to come closer to the microphone? We have a hard time hearing you. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm saying all these parts are closed. All these hotels, 45% are closed down. And you have to, the problem is you need to control the workers doing there, what they are doing. And the problem is how many of this is going to go bust. We have serious problem. We know fiscal space, as I said before, for any African country will help the business and the private sector. Now, the debt, I mean, I have not seen much action. I mean, I hear things going on, but where is the thing? I haven't seen much action yet. And I think it's about 12 billion of the 34 billion interest you should get. You will talk about sports. What is the risk? And who's doing what? And as I said earlier, China holds one-third. We have like $440 billion of debt. You don't see much. That's another discussion. But one-third of that debt at least is held by Chinese people. What China going to do about it? So we need to see some leadership, some action from China. You see also, you hope to see some action in Europe. But unfortunately, all that is going to be with the public debt. What about the private debt? There's nothing on the table to deal with the private debt and how that can be. You took second question about the private sector, what government has helped. Actually, it is the other way around. The private sector is a huge problem because, as I said, unlike the private sector in Europe, which is getting a lot of help, paying salaries of the employees, if they don't fire people, you're going to pay their salaries. In Africa, who's going to pay the salaries of the people of the private sector? It goes down. Nobody is doing it. So it's the private sector who's trying to help in Africa. It's not in a situation to help other people. It is really against the law. And that's really worrying. Because you need to see the private sector in Africa. Because that's the way forward. So you need to see how, and the danger for me as well is if things continue to go badly, all our champions, our African companies are going to be snapped up very cheaply by Chinese or other people. You know, so even trying to build business, African business there is going to fail because, and we are not, I mean, look, Germany the other day intervened there was this company developing a vaccine, and Americans decided to invest in it. After planning, I become a landmark and said, hey, I'm putting 200 million. And they choose actually to keep this company in January. So that's what we will be able to do. So, Air France received a huge support for the KLM received a huge support for the production of the sector. So governments are intervening to support the private sector, which is fine, it's correct. But you need to protect the jobs in the country. But this is not happening. And then you ask me what private sector can do. Private sector is against the world, my dear. Cannot do anything. It is weak already, and now it will weaken more. I'm sorry, it's not a beautiful answer. But, that is a fact.
Thank you. It's from the ground. So, Marianne, could you unmute yourself and then ask? I guess you have something on governance more specifically now for Mr. Lenarcic.
Yes, I have a second question. Thank you very much, Commissioner, and thank you for the work that you're doing on the continent. So my second question is on the pandemic effects on governance, stability, and peace and security. On the one hand, the pandemic has triggered improvements in the provision of social safety nets and even helped income loss, mitigated adverse impact on the poor and the vulnerable. On the other hand, in the wake of COVID-19, we have seen militias, we have seen terrorist groups filling in for the absence of the state. They've been providing basic goods and services. For instance, you have Boko Haram who have stepped up attacks in West Africa, and this is one case in point. My question is, what is the EU's political action and commitment to support the continent as it moves in these directions of improved governance, service delivery, and how can it help prevent the continent from descending into more instability?
Thank you, Marianne Guevara, for this question. I think you have pointed to a key challenge for Africa and ourselves, namely governance. But before going into that, I would like to say that there is concern that this pandemic, this COVID crisis, will or may further exacerbate already existing tensions, already existing humanitarian and other crisis situations. That's why we need, in my view, to intensify our work in order to prevent that. Even without COVID, things have not been going well globally. Just recent UNHCR report stated that the number of forcibly displaced people around the world has reached almost 80 million. This is unprecedented high number. And as I said, COVID, and especially its economic and social impact, may only aggravate further the existing critical situations. That's why, in my view, we need to step up our efforts to prevent that. You mentioned Boko Haram. I could see the devastation caused by the activities of this armed group when I visited in January the Borno state. And even without COVID, the situation, of course, is critical. Now, how the EU is trying to help? We are trying to help in three tracks. First one is humanitarian. This is designed to address the most urgent needs of affected communities by providing food, shelter, health items, water and sanitation, and other life-saving assistance in urgent situations, in the situations of urgent needs. The second, more mid and long-term activity is development, cooperation, and partnership. Here we tackle various ways of how to help communities build better lives. And strengthening public services in general and improved governance is essential in this respect. Essential. And this is a vital part of our development partnership agenda, because without it, all our efforts will not succeed. Good governance is key. And the third track is cooperation in military and security area. Of course, when there is no peace, when there is violence, you cannot work on development. So peace is an essential ingredient, essential precondition for development to take place. This approach, we call it integrated approach. We try to combine all these tracks whenever appropriate in order to help our partners advance on the way to stability and prosperity in a sustainable way, and avoid what you say in your question, the danger of descending into more instability. But in short, in our view, good governance which is based on peace, a peaceful environment, is, in our view, essential for unlocking the potential of Africa.
Thank you very much. Marianne had to step out because of connect related issues. We are quickly drawing to a close of this 1 hour. I think we covered quite a lot of ground, ranging from demography to development to innovation in health to now security. Perhaps by way of conclusion, it's difficult to conclude because on many of these issues, the jury is still out, especially when it comes to the impact, the long-term impact of the pandemic. Perhaps by way of conclusion, it's useful to mention that a geopolitical commission in Africa, it's a very bold proposition and a very bold association, because usually we associate the term geopolitics, if you are an observer of international relations, with issues such as power and influence. And I suppose in this case, we are talking as much about Europe's influence as much about Africa's own power and influence. So if anything, a geopolitical commission in Africa is about empowering Africa as such. And this helps me to first of all thank our two speakers, Mr. Lenarcic and Mr. Ibrahim, for having intervened. To remind you that, in fact, and it was not accidental, this focus on geopolitics, because next week's seminar will be on geopolitics, and our director, Alexander Stubb, will be joined by Helga Schmidt, the Secretary General of the European External Action Service, and Michael McFaul, former US ambassador to Russia and now professor at Stanford University. For now, thanks again to the two speakers and to all of you for joining us today, and see you again next Monday.